From Clyde Golden, I'm Tim Yaden, and this is Input Doc. It's the podcast where we explore what marketers need and what agencies provide. Ryan Polich is a design director at Lucia Marquand here in Seattle, which develops designs and produces books for museums and other cultural institutions. Thanks for coming on Input Doc today, Ryan.
I am happy to be here.
So you've been at Lucia Marquand for nearly 10 years.
Yeah, just about.
And tell me about your role there.
It's, the bulk of my work is design, which is what I love to do. And it's designing books, which is, for me, when I was in school, that's like this sort of like pinnacle of graphic design. Like that's where type and images meet and live together forever, is on the pages of a book. And so finding a way to do that. And then on top of that, do that in a world where I'm looking at art and working with curators who are talking about art history and that sort of thing. I know it's cliche, but it's totally a dream job. It's really.
Where else would you do a job like this?
That's a really good question. Not many places. Uh-huh. We occasionally work with other designers. If a designer might come attached to a project, or a curator has a good relationship with one. And I would say 9 times out of 10, they're freelance or they own their own very small studio. Yeah, it's definitely a small industry to have found a place in.
Well, and I mean, you're listed under a design agency. Lucia Marquand is a design agency, but the channel is books, or the output is books.
Yeah.
And the audience is primarily museums. I think I looked at the site. It said museums, artists, creative professionals, publishers, and collectors. And so that's a fairly wide range, actually. There's all sorts of projects that would come in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that's, what the company was kind of built on was the museum publishing vein. And that's definitely the bulk of our work still. But every now and then we work directly with an artist, or if there's an artist and a gallerist working together, that's common too, and collectors as well. Those are some of the more odd books sometimes, where there'd be someone that just has a collection of something that they want to make a book about, and we'll work with them to make it happen. So, but yeah, it offers a really wide range of material and a lot of ways of looking at art through books differently. Some of the artists' books are really great. We get to work. Ed Marquand, the founder of the company, has a letterpress studio and bindery in Central Washington. So we get to do special projects out there that are letterpress printed and hand bound and interesting materials and custom everything. And those are really great kind of creative outlets.
What is the name of that town where he's in?
Tieton.
That's right. Because right out front, you guys are downtown, and Paper Hammer is right out front of your office. Some people may know you guys that way, which it's a slightly separate business, but still, I mean, it feels like you've been creating a few things for them as well. Yeah,
there's definitely a link there. When Paper Hammer was kind of earlier on, we were doing a lot more design work for the store, and Ed's that's been his world in the last few years, and designing products. And
well, tell me about the process of designing a book. I mean, a request comes in. On average, how do you work through what this book might look like, and what are the parts of the journey of even pre-production?
Sure. Well, so maybe one of my favorite parts of the process is actually that kind of initial conversation, because most of the time, like I said, since we're working with museums, it's usually a curator that has, come up with an exhibition that the book is linked to. That's almost always driving it. Okay, we'll do collection books for museums and handbooks and stuff, but most of the time they're tied to an exhibition. This curator has done potentially years of research and work shaping this exhibition, focusing on the themes of the works that they're gathering. And so talking to them, it's actually kind of invigorating for both parties, I think, because it gives them a chance to explain the thesis of their exhibition to someone who's totally new to it, since I'm just walking in. And it also gives me a way to kind of tap into their excitement for the material. And the best projects are those where like that, there's kind of just an immediate click where everyone is excited about what the work holds and what that means for the design of the book. And so, I usually I start thinking in kind of really broad terms about what the book should feel like, who it's for, what it should be as an object and how it should exist in the world, and getting those kind of broader ideas on the table then kind of helps me focus as I'm making more specific choices about, materials and paper and typefaces and how images sit on a page. And so, yeah, that's kind of how things start. And then there's a pretty intense period where I'm just working through options, finding ways to kind of hold the material in the best way possible in terms of the design. And then the book gets laid out, and there's kind of a group of people that initially it's really kind of an insulated conversation between myself as the designer and the curator, and sometimes if there's a publications manager or something who's invested at the beginning.
I think that's interesting where you're thinking about what the book feels like. Is there a tactile conversation as far as weight of a book, or even how the book is used, and therefore what material should be used in creating it?
Yeah. And I think this was one of the things that when I started at the company was definitely a conversation that was always in the air, was justifying the existence of books. Because there were all these, articles about, is this the death of the book, and the Kindle was happening, and everything was moving to digital formats. And people were really worried about that with art books, that would just dry up and not exist anymore. And what we found over time is that kind of the opposite has happened. And I think people have realized that you get a sensory experience from reading a physical book that's impossible to replicate through a screen. So we always felt that way. And then it kind of seemed like the general consensus started tipping that way after a while, after also realizing how difficult it is to make something like an art book useful in any way in a digital format. I mean, it might be useful, but it might not be nice to look at. So that's just this conversation kept growing. And now I've found a lot of times that curators will come to us with ideas in mind already about what this book should be as an object, which is really nice, because it means you're thinking about it as this physical thing that's going to live in the world for quite a long time, hopefully. And you kind of invest some importance in all of those decisions that way. Yeah, that's one of the things that really makes me excited about the design work that I do, is you get this thing you can hold at the end of it, and you can flip the pages and smell the ink. And
you're talking about the actual nature, the object itself that's being made. And I hadn't thought about that so much, because I think when you and I have talked in the past, you're a designer. And I think of composition on a page versus the idea of creation of an object, of a tactile thing that has weight. It's almost, there's a touch of industrial design to it.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, book designers. There's AIGA there's like the 50 books, 50 covers competition every year. There are definitely some that I would definitely qualify as industrial design. They come in crazy extruded plastic slipcases, or, do things above and beyond what you'd even expect a book to be. But I think that's also fascinating, because what we define as a book is pretty malleable. And I think keeping that in mind is really interesting. We don't necessarily have the room in the work that we do to go that wild, but knowing that you can is.
Let's talk about that for a second. What is the spectrum of a book? I've never thought about this.
Yeah. I mean, so you could break it down to the simplest definition of a bound set of pages with content, how it's bound, what the pages are made of, how big they are. And as a result, how they fold or roll, or I think that's what's really interesting too, is there are so many things you can do to each of the independent materials of a book. Paper can be folded, it can be cut, it can be perforated, and then you add printing, and then there are all the physical components of binding a book, the thread, the boards on front and back, if it's a hardcover, the paper or cloth you use to wrap those. So there are kind of these like just layer upon layer of materials that are on their own are very simple, but that also offer so many possibilities because of their simplicity. And it's a really interesting challenge to find ways to combine those in a way that successfully supports the content of the book itself. And that's always the goal.
Because at your core, you're an agency, and you're
right.
And a business problem is brought to you, and you need to solve it in a way that solves their problem.
Right. Yeah. And that's, there's always that balance between on the practical financial level, what are the things that we can do that there's a budget for? And a lot of times, we're working with cultural institutions. They don't have scads of money to put into a publishing program. So there are times when that becomes the design challenge, which is, how do I make this object interesting in a unique and supportive way, but do it within the confines of a budget? And you come up with some really interesting solutions that way.
I'd love to hear of several books that you really felt turned out well.
Yeah, where to start? But
they're all magic.
They're all amazing. No.
Yeah, well, we always on all of our projects do the best that we can, and in the end, we solve the problem. And some of them you're really proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those. So a recent one is there's a book that I designed for the John Michael Kohler Art Center on a woman named Lenore Tawney, who was a fiber artist and was really kind of this key figure in redefining what fiber art meant in terms of being perceived as an art form and not just a craft. And so there was always kind of this dismissive stance, one, because of the material, two, because it was work that was primarily done by women. So it was kind of relegated to this, that's not real artwork. And she was one of the people like Annie Albers who kind of tried to reclaim that and put a spotlight on it. And she invented weaving techniques that hadn't been done before. And so the work is really fantastic. And I think to talk about like what makes a project successful would be one that I'm particularly proud of. There's this sort of intersection of content that's good and interesting, because if it's something that people aren't interested in, or that I'm not interested in, or the curator's not interested in, like that spark isn't there. So that's critical. But then all of the people involved, caring equally about it is what really kind of elevates it. And so the team at the Kohler was just fantastic, and they were really invested. And the conversations about the work and the book were intermingled. And so the book itself responded to that work, and the typography and the paper textures and the color palette and all of that kind of grew out of that conversation and really became something really fantastic. So that's one that I'm particularly proud of.
A question for you on this.
Yeah.
They bring you a collection. They bring you curated information that's already been settled upon, in essence. How much say do you have in interpreting that into a book?
That's a good question. It varies. I feel like in the course of my years at the company, there's been a little more openness for interpretation than maybe there used to be. And this is an industry term that...
Within the industry, there's more openness, or just within your own agency, there's more openness?
I would have to say within our agency, because I think we used to kind of call ourselves, there's an industry term called a packager, where you get a folder with all the material in it, you make it look pretty, and you turn it into a book. And that's kind of and there are times when there are projects where that's the extent of what you need to and are able to do for something. That's certainly, that term applies, but there's definitely been, I feel like, a movement toward, interacting with the curator, who's frequently the author, at least of kind of the main essay in the book. And the more engagement you have, and the longer you have a relationship with someone, multiple projects over time, you get a chance to kind of work on those ideas earlier before they're settled and presented. And oh, here, this is how this will work. This is how this will work. Let's go ahead and design it. So that's really rewarding too. And that I think is just kind of, that comes with time and investing in those relationships.
I think that anybody who works at an agency with clients works through this as well. Sometimes you are a packager, and
right.
But then sometimes you're truly reinterpreting to a channel, or you're helping them interpret what they have into some sort of expression or communication.
Yeah.
Both are honorable and useful to your clients, but one of them you tend to remember a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. One keeps the lights on. The other
right.
keeps...
Yeah.
Yeah. It's validating to hear that your life is like that too.
Yeah. Yep. There's always, it's interesting because in books particularly, I talk about this with my wife a lot because she's a landscape designer. One of the things that I never really thought about, and often take for granted is books make an effort, especially art books, to kind of collect the information about some of the key players on the copyright page. And so there's a credit for the editor, there's a credit for the typesetter, there's a credit for the designer. And those names exist on the copyright page. And I remember the first book I designed, you look at that and you're like, oh my God, my name's in a book. And, there's kind of magic from that. But it's interesting because that frequently is not the case in almost any other design realm, because, if it's something digital, maybe you find out the firm that created it, but the individual designer wouldn't necessarily get a credit unless you're reading about it in an awards, compendium or something. And so, like I said, I talked to my wife about it because she designs these gardens, these amazing gardens, and you could drive by and really appreciate it and have absolutely no idea who was responsible for it and why. And so there are definitely books where you get to that point where the book is going to the printer and you quietly take that name off. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
Yeah, sure. Fair enough. On we go.
Yeah.
There's the great phrase I'll mutter sometimes, which is, well, that stuck to the internet, didn't it? And that was interesting to do, but you're like, on we go. What's our next gig? What's happening? What do we got? What's at 2:00? Let's keep moving here. Before designing books, how did you get into design?
Yeah, I absolutely loved books growing up. And my parents had a ton of books. My dad had, I still remember the Time Life series of notable artists and Caravaggio and Leonardo. And I remember just soaking those up when I was a kid. And I never thought at that point about how those came to be. They were just these things that you could enjoy. And then as I, fast forward, went to school, I studied photography primarily. I studied photography and graphic design. I went to school thinking about photography, and that's where a lot of my creative energy went. But as I spent more time in the design world, I realized how much typography means to me and how fascinated I am with it as a tool and as a medium. And so that was kind of knocking around. And then what's really funny is all through college, I avoided printmaking, deliberately avoided it, mainly because there was an experience I had when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade where we had to make these prints in art class. And the thing I made and what I thought I was going to get were so different. I was so just frustrated and disappointed that I was just in my head from that point on. I was like, printmaking is bad. I will never do it again. And after I got out of school, I ended up getting a graphic design job at a screen printing shop, and they needed a production designer. And it was mostly, you needed to know how to use the software and make print separations and that sort of thing. And so the work really interested me. And then when I got there and I saw the process of screen printing, I was just like, why have I not been doing this whole time? So that really kind of got me really into print in all its forms. And so I learned how to screen print. I got my own screen printing setup. And then, so this was Colorado. That's where I'm originally from. We moved to Seattle, and I got a job doing production design at a sign company, doing large signage and vinyl graphics and all that sort of stuff. But screen printed on my own time, and then eventually learned letterpress printing on my own time as well, which that further kind of pushed me towards the history of books and print and how those evolved.
Hi, everyone. This is Megan O'Neill. I'm the producer of Input Doc. The inaugural season of Input Doc is now complete, and we would love to hear your feedback from season 1, suggestions for future episodes, or if you know someone who would be a great guest on the podcast. Hey, maybe that person is you. My email is Megan, spelled MEGHAN, at ClydeGolden.com. I hope to hear from you.
So your garage is taken up by a large letterpress, correct?
It is, yes.
Yeah. Good for you. Good for you, first off. Like, don't put a car in your garage. Put something
right
there. Letterpress or a bandsaw or whatever.
Yeah. It's just got to be heavy. That's all that's really
important. It needs to be immovable so that nobody thinks a car should go into that garage. Yeah.
So that, and then it kind of just the merger of print and design and really kind of crystallized for me as what I wanted to be doing. And when I started at Lucia Marquand, it was a part-time job, and we were kind of nervous about it because I was leaving a full-time job to do it. And I'm so glad I did, because it's the world that I want to be in.
Tell me a little bit about what you find interesting about typography.
Type has always fascinated me because there's nothing else quite like it, in that it's this series of just completely abstract shapes that we use to communicate basically everything. Like, that so much of our civilization rests on the ability to communicate without speaking to another person. And typography is what allows that to happen. So that's kind of like that core idea is really fascinating to me.
Color theory, I have a fairly solid handle on, and that a color can evoke a mood, or there's certain usages based on clients and audiences. I feel less well-versed in type and choosing type, whether I choose a serif or a sans. Always I have a design director or a visual designer who is realistically, I'm going to allow to make that call. But I would imagine that a lot of your life is based around that. And
yeah.
What's a methodology you have or process you have for choosing type for a project?
Sure. Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite parts, is I can really kind of dig into making those decisions. So one of the things that I think is also unique to the designing art books is that they get to exist a little bit outside of the other trends in design that happen. And so I read a lot about typography, and, there's been this, it's probably been a 5 to 10 year wave now of like clean geometric sans serif faces. And, oh, here's another new clean geometric sans serif face. And, companies rebranding and going with something in that vein. And those faces certainly have their merits. But what's nice about the work that we do is, because it's not something that you see for a 3-month-long campaign or whatever, you get to kind of step outside of that energy a little bit and focus on really just kind of honoring the material in the book. So the design solution is really about what's in that book you're making, and less about if someone's going to see this in 2020 or 2030 or whatever. For me, what really informs typographic decisions is the material itself, and how the type can either respond and activate that work, or sometimes step aside and let the work do the talking. And each project calls for a different combination of those things. But I do a lot of reading about typographical history and the history of type in print over time, because a lot of the work we're talking about comes from early in the 20th century or in the 19th century or even older. And so looking back at what type was doing in those eras and how that could influence the design of the book is something that's really interesting to do. But yeah, it's all about finding a link between what the letter forms you're seeing on the page and the work that they're talking about.
We're in the middle of a cultural shift right now. We're sitting here in a pandemic, and I would suppose that will impact choices like that in the future. I mean, you're probably going to see shifts in color, typography. I think tone is going to change a bit from humor, or I think humor is always great, but I think we're moving basically from a meme economy to something that perhaps is a little more factual and just quiet at the moment, because emotionally that's probably all we can handle. And I suppose there's a moment where we're going to come out of it, and it's going to be just this big post-prohibition celebration that occurs at some point. Is that something that you think about when you're designing a book, as far as capturing a moment of now versus long-term?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know that I've ever thought about it in those terms. I think I tend to think about now last in terms of the books I'm designing.
What's the project length of a book, or how long does it take from?
And it's about 9 months from kind of when we get the material to printed books being delivered. Prior to that, it's, like I said, it can be years. As their
website can take that long easily.
Sure. Yeah. I think the way that our books kind of intersect that kind of now design is when there is an exhibition, and frequently the exhibition's being designed by someone on staff at the museum, if there's a push to link the book to the exhibition so strongly that like this has happened where they'll say, oh, could you use the exhibition graphics for the title? And that's something we try to avoid whenever we can. And largely for that reason, because the exhibition is about being there. It's about that moment in history. And if you want to use a, trendy typeface to plaster the walls of the museum with to get people in there because that's something fresh for them to be seeing, that's a marketing strategy that totally makes sense. But when you think about a book, like the whole point of a book is for it to outlive the moment of that exhibition. And so we always try and think about the design doing that same thing. So
interesting. Yeah. And because the book is going to be here for a long, long time, but that moment in time of the exhibition will go. Yeah. Do you have any 2 or 3 favorite designed books that you didn't work on that you would point us to go take a look at? As in, we all have stuff that makes us jealous.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll try and reduce it to just a couple. There's one that immediately comes to mind because I was thinking about it the other day. It's called Experience, and it was published by the MIT Press probably 4 or 5 years ago now. And it's not an art book per se. It's pretty academic, and it talks a lot about human sensory experience. And there are a number of essays that kind of center on that theme. But the design and the production of the book itself focus on exactly what we've been talking about, like really making it a sensory experience. And so when you see the book on the shelf, it's all black with black foil stamped for the title on the front cover. And when you pick it up and hold it, the ink they've used on the cover is a heat sensitive. So after you've held it for a couple minutes, you take your hand away and all of a sudden you see pink and green underneath as the black has faded because your hand has warmed it. And then they printed the end papers with pheromones, actually, to I can't remember exactly what the pheromones are, but the idea was that they're human pheromones that make you like stuff. And so they printed that in the end papers. Maybe this is why I'm thinking about this book, but pheromones just cemented it.
Well, the title Experience suggests it's what's in there.
Yeah.
It's best to be experienced. And this was a way of expressing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Is there any scratch and sniff? There's no. I'm sorry for asking that, everybody. Nonetheless, you never do know, because you'd be like, yeah, actually.
Yeah. That's the collector's edition.
Yeah. And then a couple trivia questions about typography. I don't usually do this, but what are your favorite typefaces? And then what are currently the most overrated typefaces that you're seeing everywhere? In my world, stock photography, there's a guy who looks just like Stanley Tucci that I see everywhere. And we're always, every time we see him, we're like, there he is. And, we had put him on something about a year ago. And I would imagine that you're seeing specific type chosen over and over. And you think, come on, let's think this through a little bit better.
Yeah. There's kind of a running joke internally about Bembo, because I think it's a
serif with sans.
It's a serif, and it's a very kind of Renaissance looking serif. And so I think there's this idea that, it's classical typography and it must be in my book. And it's funny because I am definitely of the camp that there are no bad typefaces. You just got to find the right way to use them. So it's not inherently bad. The problem is the things that people think it's capable of doing that it's not. And the fact on a practical level, there's no digital version of it that looks good. So there's this idea of what it should look like that it never lives up to. And so it's, disappointing. In terms of favorites, that changes often, but a current favorite, there's a type family called Founders Grotesque by Klim, who's a type designer out of New Zealand who just, all his work is amazing. And it's based on turn of the 20th century kind of scrappy, grotesque wood type.
Okay.
And it's got, I don't know, it's got a lot of character, but it also is really sturdy and useful. I don't know if you talk about this in your design work, but we talk about workhorse typefaces, a typeface that can do whatever you throw at it. And this is definitely one of those. It's just it looks great as a title, but it can also work as tiny, 7-point caption type or something if you needed to. And those things are always in the back of my head as I'm looking at typefaces.
Really interesting. Well, thank you very much for coming on Input Doc today. This is a really
thanks for having me.
Educational conversation for me because I have questions about typography and many other things that you do. And I'm probably not done drilling with questions in your lifetime about this.
Well, anytime you have more, just let me know.
Are there places online where people could learn more about you that you'd want to tell them about?
I post stuff to my Instagram every now and then.
What's your handle there?
Polich, Polich. And I've got a website that is collecting dust because I never touch it, which is just ryanpolich.com.
And then where can they see your professional work? Where's the Lucia Marquand website?
That's luciamarquand.com. And we're actually, I don't know if I have clearance to announce this, but we're revamping the site. We're going to unveil it soon. So it looks really great.
Everybody should always be thinking about revamping their site. And that's totally healthy.
Yeah. No, it's an improvement for sure. It looks really great.
Oh yeah. I mean, the life expectancy of a website far exceeds our love for our specific websites. Let's put it that way. We're always mildly embarrassed by what we have online.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. And it's okay. Either you don't have a site. I deal with this all the time. Either they don't have a site and they're irritated with themselves, or they have a site and they're irritated with the site. And there's only like a brief moment in time where right after you launch and they look at you and they're like, this is great. This is so much better than it was before. And a month later, there's 37 fixes. Like, we got to do this and this and this and this.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's so, for me anyway, so opposite to where my design brain sits, like designing for something that is so ephemeral and so intangible. And, all the principles are the same, but it's hard for me to think about because I want to make something on paper.
Yeah. But this was a good test for you as a person to make something online.
Yeah.
Okay, Ryan. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Input Doc is produced by Megan O'Neill, edited by Lily Chu. The music you're listening to is an original creation by our very own Brian Leahy. We'd also like to thank our project manager, Scott Greger, who does all the work at the agency while we make this podcast. I'm your host, Tim Yaden. Have a great day.